The notice had been posted for 11 days before she answered it. She had read it the first time standing in the doorway of Pellerin's general store in Moose Jaw, her coat still damp from the walk-in, and she had not gone in right away but stood there reading it twice over. The way she read things she was not sure what to do with. Someone had pinned it low on the board, below the notices for hay auctions and a lost mule, and a woman offering piano lessons to children under 12. It was written in a careful hand that did not waste ink. Grain operation, 14 miles north. Looking for someone with bookkeeping and a strong back. Arrangement honest. Work starts when ground thaws. There was a name at the bottom, Drummond, and a postmaster in a place called Langwell she had not heard of. She had not answered it that day. She had bought her flour and her lamp oil and walked back to the room she was letting above the laundry on Fairford Street, where the ceiling ran with condensation in the cold months, and the smell of other people's washing came up through the floorboards at all hours. She had set the flour on the shelf and sat down at the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap and thought about it without deciding anything. She was 32 years old. She had come to Moose Jaw from Brandon the previous spring after her father died and left a set of debts that took everything but her winter coat and her ability to add a column of numbers without a pencil. So in Brandon, she had kept the books for a hardware supply for 4 years, and before that she had done the same for her father's grain agency, beginning at 17. When her mother got sick and someone had to, she had spent most of her adult life being competent in rooms where competence was not expected of her, and she had learned to move quietly around the fact of it. She had not expected to be 32 and letting a room above a laundry. She had not expected a good many things. On the 11th day, she wrote a letter to the postmaster in Langwell and said she had experience with books, with grain records and crop yields and weather ledgers, and that she was not afraid of work and was available to speak to the man named Drummond at his convenience. She mailed it on a Thursday. A reply came the following Tuesday. It was not long. It said he would be in Moose Jaw on the Friday to pick up a part for the cedar. She could meet him at the livery on Atkinson Street at 9:30 if she wanted to see what she was getting into before she agreed to anything. He had put that at the end, before she agreed to anything. She read it as a kind of respect, though she had no way to be sure. She was at the livery at 9:15. He was already there. He had his back to her when she came in, crouching beside one of the rear wheels of a flatbed wagon, running his thumb along the inside of the rim. The wagon was old, but the boards were sound. Someone had replaced the sideboards in sections, different wood grains sitting side by side, not for the look of it, but because that was when each section had needed doing. The horses were a matched pair of bays, heavier than she'd expected for the prairies, built for pulling through mud rather than speed. Their coats were winter-rue, but their feet were clean and their eyes were clear. She noted all of that before he heard her come in. He stood and turned. He was perhaps 40, or he was perhaps 35. The wind and the cold had made those years difficult to count. He had the look of a man who had been outside through every season without giving it much thought. Dark eyes. A jaw that hadn't been shaved in a few days, not from carelessness, from being busy. He looked at her the way she had sometimes seen men look at an unexpected piece of equipment, not dismissively, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular attention of someone revising their estimate. He said, "You're the one who wrote." It was not quite a question. She said, "I am." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "The operation is wheat and some oats on the north quarter. I've got a hired man, Tomas, been with me 3 seasons. He does what 2 men do, but there are things neither of us can manage." She said, "What kind of things?" He said, "The books are 4 months behind and the grain agent in Langwell has been charging me the wrong rate since October, and I haven't had time to prove it." She said, "What rate is he charging you?" He said the number. She said, "What rate did you agree to in the contract?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd have to look at the paper," she said. "Do you have it with you?" He looked at her. Then he went to the wagon and lifted the seat box and took out a folded paper and handed it to her. She read it standing in the livery doorway with the cold coming in at her back. She said, "He's been charging you 3/4 of a cent over on every bushel since October. Depending on your volume, you're looking at somewhere between $40 and $60. He took the paper back and looked at it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It tightened slightly, the way a face does when something a person has been suspicious of is confirmed. He said, "I had a number in my head close to that," she said. "Then you should have known for certain." He looked at her. She had not said it unkindly. He folded the paper and put it back in the seat box. He said, "There's a room off the back of the house, separate door. Window faces south." He paused. "You'd have the light in the afternoons." She did not know what to do with the detail about the window. She put it somewhere and kept it, he said. "I won't tell you it's easy work. The ground took 3 hard winters in a row and last season's yield was off. We're behind where we should be, but the land is not the problem." She said, "What is the problem?" He said, "Water in the wrong places and not enough of it in the right ones. And the east field has been draining into the low before it has a chance to do anything useful." She said, "How long has it been draining that way?" He said, "Since I bought the parcel from Voss 4 years ago. The tile on that side is original to Voss's father." She said, "Then it's been wrong for 20 years and it didn't get that way overnight." He said, "No." Then he said, "It's about 2 hours north if the road holds." She said she could be ready on Sunday. He nodded once and went back to the wheel. The road was frozen and rutted from the last thaw that had come too early in the season and then been undone by a week of hard nights. She sat on the bench beside him and did not hold the edge of it but let herself learn the rhythm of the wagon over the rough ground. The sky was the particular gray of early March in Saskatchewan. A gray that did not move or shift but simply sat there like a lid. He did not speak for the first hour. She did not fill the silence. She watched the land instead. The fields on either side of the road had the flat, beaten look of ground that had given what it had and was waiting to be asked again. The snow was mostly gone in the open stretches, but held in the low spots and along the fence lines in gray compressed ridges. She could read the drainage from the road if she knew what to look for, and she did. You could see where the water had run in spring and where it had pooled and where it had sat too long on ground that couldn't take it. She understood something about the East Field problem before he had said another word about it. After a while, he said, "Thomas has been managing the East Field planting on his own the last 2 years. He does it the way Voss's man taught him. I haven't had reason to change it." She said, "Is it working?" He said, "The yield on that quarter is about 60% of what the west side puts out." She said, "Then you have reason." He looked at her. He did not seem offended. He seemed to be deciding what to make of her, which was a different. The farm came visible as they came over, a gradual rise, a house and a long low barn, and 2 outbuildings, the way working farms were arranged, not for the look of it, but for the function, so that a man moving between them in the dark or in a storm didn't have to go far between one shelter and the next. A granary sat back from the barn with a newer roof, recently reshingled, the wood still pale against the weathered gray of the rest. She noted that someone had spent the money on the granary first. He pulled up at the top of the rise for a moment. She did not know if that was his habit, or if he was seeing the place through her eyes and feeling something about the gap between what it had been and what it was. He said, "It was a good operation when my father ran it." She said, "The structure's still right." He looked at her. She said, "The granary's in good repair. The barn faces right for the weather. The house is on high enough ground to stay dry." "You've got the bones," he said. "The bones don't put grain in the elevator." She said, "No, but they're what you build from." He did not answer that. He picked up the reins and they came down off the rise. The man named Thomas was coming out of the barn when they pulled in. He was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his mid-20s, with the compact, careful movements of someone who had learned to work in small spaces and not waste energy. And he was Ukrainian by the look of him, or his family had been, with a broad forehead and pale eyes, and the particular stillness of a person who observed more than he spoke. He looked at her without expression and then looked at the man beside her. He said, in accented English that was nonetheless precise, "You got someone," the man said. "She'll be in the back room." Thomas looked at her again. He was not unfriendly. He was assessing the way both of them seemed to do, as if warmth was something to be extended after accuracy had been established. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting. Thomas watched that. Something in his face settled. The room off the back of the house had a separate door, as he'd said, and a window that faced south. There was a cot and a small chest, and a hook on the wall, and a wood stove in the corner that had not been lit in some time. The glass in the window was intact. The door latch worked. She counted those as points in the house's favor and unpacked in the order she always unpacked, necessities first. When she came into the main kitchen, she found the stove cold and the wood box low and a collection of papers on the table that had been stacked with the vague optimism of someone who intends to deal with them later and has not gotten to it. She counted 4 months of receipts, elevator slips, seed invoices, and 2 letters from the Langwell Grain Company she suspected had not been answered. She lit the stove. She found bread and salt pork on the shelf and put something together for supper without asking. When he came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove and then at the table and then at her. She said, "You want to eat before we talk about the books or after?" He took his hat off and hung it on the post. He said, "Thomas eats with me." She said, "I set 3 places." He came to the table and sat. He sat with his back to the wall. She noted it the way she noted most things, without storing it as anything larger than it was. A man who had spent years with his back to the cold and his eyes on the door. Thomas came in a few minutes later and sat without ceremony. The 2 of them had the comfortable silence of men who had been in difficulty together long enough to stop talking about it. She put the food on the table. Thomas looked at his plate and then looked at her and said, "This is more than usual," she said. "I found the pantry." He said, "We know where the pantry is." She said, "Then you know where it will be tomorrow." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. He turned back to his plate. The man at the head of the table ate without comment, but he ate all of it. She noticed that. After, Thomas took his own plate to the basin. The man did the same. She had not expected that either. She washed up while they went back to the barn, and the last of the light left the window above the sink. She had been awake before the color changed in the east window. She dressed in the dark and lit the stove and was looking at the ledger books by the time the sky had gone from black to the particular dark blue that meant another hour yet. The books were, as he had said, a disaster. Not because the numbers were wrong. He had recorded everything, every bushel, every load, every payment. The disaster was in the organization, or the absence of it. Things were entered as they happened, in whatever order they happened, with no system for finding anything later. The grain company's rate discrepancy was buried in 3 separate months and would have taken a man with patience half a day to untangle. She had it mapped on a clean page inside of 40 minutes. She heard him come in from the barn while she was still at the table. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She turned the ledger around so he could see the clean page sheet. "You're owed $63.40 from Langwell Grain. Here is the month. Here is the rate they charged. Here is what the contract says. Here is the difference. I've written it so that when you take this to the agent, you won't have to explain it twice." He looked at the page for a long moment. His expression did not show surprise exactly. It showed the particular look of a man who has known something was wrong and has now been handed the shape of it. He said, "How long did that take you?" She said, "Long enough." He said, "I've had that ledger open on this table since November." She said, I know, I can see where you started 3 times and stopped." She turned the ledger back around. "I'm going to restructure the whole thing. It will take about a week. After that, you'll be able to find anything in it in under 5 minutes. He looked at her. He said, "All right." He poured his own coffee and set a cup near her without asking if she wanted one. She wrapped both hands around it and kept working. Thomas came in and ate standing at the counter, looking at her sideways in the way of someone trying to understand what exactly was happening without asking directly. She didn't explain. She refilled his coffee when she refilled her own, and that seemed to be enough. On the 3rd day, she asked to see the east field. The ground was not ready yet for anything. Still too wet in the low places. But she could read the winter damage well enough. She walked the field with him in the late afternoon, the light going flat and blue the way it did in March, and she could see without being told where the tile had failed. The ground was soft in long, irregular patches that ran counter to the slope, which meant the water was finding its own path rather than the one the tile was meant to give it. In 2 places, the earth had subsided slightly above where she guessed the old drain to be. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil at the low edge of the field where it met the fence line. She stood up and looked out at the field and then back at the house. She said, "How many acres is this quarter?" He said, 160, about 110 under cultivation on this side. She said, "And the west quarter is what?" He said, "Same, but the soil's heavier, holds more." She said, "That's not why it outperforms." She looked at the long flat run of the field. "It outperforms because the drainage on the west side works. Someone put the tile in right over there and wrong over here, and the difference is in your yield numbers every year." He said, "I know the tile is bad." She said, "Do you know where?" He was quiet. She said, "I'd want to walk it again when the ground dries out more. But I think there are 2 collapses, maybe 3, and if you open them up and relay that section before seeding, you could bring this quarter up to within 10 or 15% of the west side, inside of 2 seasons. He looked at the field. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been losing to for a long time, and has begun to accept the losing. Then he looked at her. He said, "What does that cost?" She said, "Less than what you're losing." He did not answer right away. The light had gone from flat to gray, and the temperature was dropping. She could feel it through her coat. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the low place in the field where the subsidence showed. He said, slowly, "My father always said this quarter had something wrong with it. He blamed the soil." He paused. "Voss blamed the soil too. I bought it because the price was low and I thought I could work it harder than they had." She said, "The soil's fine. It's been sitting in water. It has no way to move." She turned back toward the house. He did not say anything more that evening. But at supper, he set the field map on the table beside the bread and ate with it open in front of him. And she could see him looking at it between mouthfuls in the same way she had seen him look at the ledger page. Not with hope exactly. More with the expression of a man examining a door he had been told was locked and is now being told the key exists somewhere. Tomas watched all of this without comment. He watched most things without comment. But that evening, when she was at the basin, he came and stood beside her and dried the plates in the way of someone who had found the rhythm of a thing and did not want to disrupt it. And after a while he said, quietly, "He does not give up on a thing easy. When he believes it can be done," she said, "Good." Thomas said nothing more. He set the last plate on the shelf and went to the barn. The tile work had to wait for drier ground, but there was enough to do in the meantime. She finished restructuring the ledger in 8 days, not a week. She built a system for the grain records that any person could follow, with separate pages for each quarter and a running tally at the front that showed the season's position at a glance. She drafted the letter to the Langwell Grain Company regarding the rate discrepancy and left it on the table for him to sign. He read it twice, made one change to a number she had intentionally left a hair low to see if he was paying attention, and signed it. She noticed that he had caught the number. She filed it. The ground dried through the last week of March and into the first days of April. She walked the east field twice more, once alone in the early morning when the light was low enough to show the ground's contours clearly, and once with him and Tomas together. The second time she carried a length of wire and marked the places where she thought the tile had failed, pushing the wire into the ground at an angle so the flag showed above the frost line. Tomas looked at her placement of the flags and said, "That is 4. She said, "I think so. The last one I'm less certain about." He crouched at the last flag and pressed his palm flat against the soil, the way she had seen people do with horses, feeling for something. He said, "No, you are right. There is something soft here." She looked at him. He said, "I put in field tile at my uncle's farm in Manitoba when I was 14. I know the feel." She said, "Then you know how to relay it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Then that part is yours." He looked at her for a moment, and in his face was something that was not quite surprise but close to it, as if he had expected to be given instructions and had been given responsibility instead. He stood up and looked at the flags marking the run of failed tile across the field. He said, "It will take 4 days, maybe 5. She said, "Write down what you need and I'll put it in the supply order." She turned back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him say something under his breath in Ukrainian that she did not understand, but the tone of it was not unhappy. The letter from the Langwell Grain Company came back in the second week of April. They acknowledged the error. They had enclosed a check. The amount was $61.15, not the $63.40 she had calculated. She set the check on the table and set her calculation beside it and looked at both for a moment. Then she went to find him in the barn. She said, "They came back short." He came and looked at the two papers. He said, "By how much?" She said, $2.25, he said. "Is it worth the letter?" She said. "It's worth knowing whether they made an error or decided to see if you'd notice." He looked at her. He said, "Which do you think it is?" She said. "I think they decided to see." His jaw tightened slightly. He said, "Then write the letter." She wrote it. The remaining amount came back 3 weeks later with no explanation, which was itself the explanation. She put both checks in the ledger under the month and noted the dates in the margin. That evening he came in from the field later than usual, after the light had gone and Tomas had already eaten and gone to the bunkhouse. She had kept a plate warm on the back of the stove. He came in, washed at the basin, and sat down, and she set the plate and went back to the ledger. He ate without speaking. After a while he said, "You didn't have to keep it warm." She said, "It was no trouble." He said, "You could have eaten." She said, "I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The tile work on the east side. Tomas says it'll be done by Thursday." She said, "He said 4 days. He's been out there since first light." He said, "Yes." He looked at the table. "He hasn't worked like that in a while." She kept her eyes on the ledger. She said, "He needed something to be his." The man was quiet for a long moment. She did not look up. She could hear him behind her, the sound of a fork against the plate, the particular stillness of a man sitting with a thought he is not sure how to put down. He said, "How did you know what was needed?" She said, "I paid attention." He did not answer that. He took his plate to the basin. She heard the water run. He dried his hands and came back to the table and stood there for a moment, and she looked up then because the quality of the silence had changed. He said, "I want to put the west quarter into canola this season. Half of it." She said, "The price is good right now." He said, "It won't hold." She said, "No, but this season it will." He nodded. He said, "I'd need the numbers. What the conversion costs against what we stand to gain." She said, "I'll have it for you by morning." He looked at her, not the way he had looked at her in the livery in Moose Jaw, recalibrating. A different look, the one she had come to recognize by now as the look he had when something had settled into place. He said goodnight and went to his room. She worked until the lamp needed trimming, and then she worked a little longer. The numbers she put on the table by 7 in the morning included 2 scenarios, the conservative and the optimistic, with the weather variables noted at the side, and the elevator distance and current road conditions factored in. She had clipped a notice from the grain grower's guide she'd found in the bottom of the seat box some weeks ago, a short piece on canola futures, and attached it to the back page with a pin. He read it over breakfast without speaking. Tomas read it after him, slowly, moving his lips slightly on the harder words. Tomas said, "This is good work," she said. "It's just arithmetic." He said, "It is not just arithmetic." She did not argue. She refilled both their cups and went to put her coat on because there was a section of fence along the south side of the east field that she had noticed last week was beginning to lean, and she wanted to look at it before the ground softened further. The fence needed 3 posts reset and a section of wire tightened. She came back to the barn for the tools and found him already loading them into the back of the small wagon without being asked. He had been watching out the barn window, she supposed, or had seen her looking at it earlier in the week and had remembered. She did not ask which. They reset the posts together, trading the spade and the tamper between them in the natural rhythm of 2 people who had been working alongside each other long enough to stop announcing what they were doing next. The ground was soft enough to work, but not so soft as to be difficult. By the time the sun was straight up, they had done all 3. He drove the last post and stood back and looked at the line of the fence. He said, "That one's been going since fall." She said, "I know. I saw it my first week." He looked at her. She had not said it to accuse him. She said it the way she said most things, as information. He said, "Why didn't you say?" She said, "You had the East Field to think about, and the grain company, and the ledger." She picked up the tamper. The fence wasn't going anywhere faster than the other things. He took the tamper from her. They walked back to the wagon. That evening there was a late frost warning on the radio in the kitchen, the small battery set that sat on the shelf above the door. She heard it while she was washing up and went out to tell him. He was at the barn with Tomas, already covering the seedling flats they had started in the south window of the barn for early transplants. He looked up when she came in and said, "We heard." She picked up a flat and began moving it to the back of the barn where the temperature held better. No one told her to. She simply saw what was being done and did the nearest part of it, the way she had always moved through work, finding the next necessary thing and doing it. Tomas looked at her sideways. He said to the man something in Ukrainian. The man said, "English, Tomas." Tomas said, "I said she moves like someone who has been here longer than she has." The man did not answer, but she noticed when she set the flat down and straightened that he was looking at her, and then looked away when she looked back. The frost came that night and left by morning, and the seedlings were fine. She had been there 2 months when the east field went in. She rode out with them in the wagon at first light on the seeding day, the 3 of them sitting across the bench in the early cold with their coffee going cool in their hands, and the sky ahead of them the color of the inside of a mussel shell. The cedar was overhauled and running right. Tomas had worked on it for a week. The new tile was in and had already done its work through the spring melt, the field draining clean where before it had sat. She watched from the headland while they made the first pass. The soil turned up dark and even behind the cedar. No pooling at the low end. No pale, exhausted patches where the water had sat too long. Just ground doing what ground was supposed to do when you let the water move. She stood there for longer than she needed to. When they came back around on the second pass, he slowed the tractor and looked at her from the cab. She did not say anything. She held up one hand. He looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the field and brought the tractor around. The canola on the west side went in the following week. The price held through June. There was an evening in early June when she was sitting at the table with the ledger open, running the year-to-date numbers against last year's, and she heard him come in from the barn and stop in the kitchen. But he didn't come to the table. She looked up. He was standing at the counter with a small bunch of early crocuses he had found somewhere, the pale lavender kind that came up along the south face of the granary before anything else did. He set them in the empty jam jar on the windowsill without comment and went to wash his hands. She looked at the crocuses. She looked at the window. She went back to the ledger. He sat down at the other end of the table and opened the field map, and they worked across from each other in the easy quiet that required nothing from either of them. Outside, the light was still going at 9 o'clock the way it did in June in Saskatchewan, the sky holding on to the last of it far longer than any reasonable sky had cause to. He said at some point without looking up from the map, "The east field will come up to yield this season or close to it." She said, "It'll be within 15%. I'd say 12. He said, "You'd say 12 because you want to be right on the low side." She looked at him. He was looking at the map, she said. He almost smiled. She could see the edge of it, the way it pulled at one corner. She went back to her numbers. Territory newspaper, which was actually the regional agricultural paper out of Regina, ran a piece in August about operations that had turned around notable losses in consecutive drought years. The farm was mentioned in the second paragraph. They got the acreage right and the yield numbers approximately right. They spelled her name wrong. He showed it to her at the breakfast table with the paper folded to that page. She read it. Then she took a pencil from behind her ear and corrected the spelling in the margin and set it on the table between them. He looked at the correction. She said they also attributed the tile work to the previous owner. He said, "Voss?" She said, "Voss's father." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll write to the editor." She said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "It matters." She looked at him. He was looking at the paper. His jaw had the particular set it had when he had decided a thing and considered the decision made. She said, "All right." He wrote the letter that evening. She did not read it before he sealed it. It was his letter. She had learned enough about him by now to know that what he wrote would be accurate and would not say more than was necessary. The letter came back 3 weeks later in the form of a small correction printed in the next issue. It named the tile work correctly. It also, she noticed, mentioned her name again, spelled right this time. He had put the clipping in the front of the ledger by the time she found it. She did not say anything about it. She put the ledger away and went out to check the south fence, where one of the posts she had reset in April had shifted again after the wet June. Tomas had already looked at it. He was crouching at the base when she got there, working the post back to plumb with a bar and his weight against it. He said, without looking up, "I know." She handed him the tamper. He worked in silence for a moment, then said, "He does not do things like that." He nodded. She understood he meant the clipping. "Usually," she said. "Everyone does things usually, and then sometimes they do them differently." Thomas looked at her. He said, "That is also a way to put it." He finished tamping the post and stood and handed the tamper back. She looked at the line of the fence. It was straight now. The post would hold through the summer if the ground stayed reasonable. She walked back to the house. The second chair appeared on the porch the last week of August. She had not seen him build it. Though she had heard him in the evenings in the lean-to beside the barn, the particular sound of a plane moving along grain that told you a person was doing careful work rather than quick work. She had not asked what he was making. It was a plain chair, the same height and pitch as the one already there, facing the same direction, south and east, where the fields ran out to the long flat line of the horizon, and the sky over the grain was the color of something almost amber in the evening light. She sat in it the evening she found it. He came out of the barn a while later and sat in the other one. He did not say anything about the chair. She did not ask. They sat there while the light moved across the top of the grain, the way it did in late August when the wheat was nearly ready, slow and gold, and very wide. The swallows were working the field edge, the late ones, low and quick against the stubble, and the air smelled like cut grass and coming autumn, and the particular clean smell of a day's work that had gone the way work is supposed to go. She was not unhappy. She had turned the thought over before in the small room in the cold months, and she turned it over now in the evening warmth. It still came out the same way. She was not unhappy. That was not a small thing. She had spent enough years knowing the difference. The grain went off in September, east quarter and west, and the numbers at the end of it were within 11% of what she had said they would be, which was better than 12, which was what she had said, on the low side, which was what she had always meant. He found her at the ledger the evening the last of it was in, and he stood there for a moment looking at the final column. And then he said, very quietly, and without making anything more of it than it was, "You were right," she said. "About 12 or about the east field?" He said, "Both." She wrote the number in the ledger and closed it. Outside, the light had gone down to the last of it, a thin line of pale gold along the flat horizon. Through the south window, she could see the two chairs on the porch, side by side, facing the same way. She left the ledger where it was and went to put the kettle on.